I would like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Elaid Ahmed Taha, who's an economist and he's a former central banker. And he also went to University of Tokyo, where he was in the Graduate School of Economics and Public Policy. You'll be speaking about the drivers of economic growth and the role of monetary and fiscal policies with lessons from selected Middle East and North African countries. So I think it's a very exciting and pertinent topic to our forum. So yeah, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Makuto, for this introduction, and it is always my pleasure actually to be here. These are the contents I'm going to cover as my presentation progress. I will begin with gross momentum, then I will I will talk about drivers of economic growth in the region. Then inflation sources in the region actually are very important to highlight. I will shed light on what need to be done from the monetary side, what has to be done by fiscal policymakers in order to enhance the economic growth and also to control inflationary pressure in the region. My presentation actually will be from policy-oriented view rather than focus on the theoretical part of the drivers of economic growth. But I will try to include some equations, try to recall some theoretical background in order to make the discussion actually testy. The MENA region is very important to the global economy, just like other regions in the world. Enjoy considerable amounts of human and natural resources, accounts for a large share of oil and non-oil production, and exports as well. However, the adverse shocks, actually, this region or the economies of the region actually are subject to adverse shocks, mainly some trade disruptions, geopolitical tensions in some few countries, as well as climate change as well has a big impact actually on the economic dynamic. The last year actually is like climate change and natural disaster hit some North African economies like Libya and Morocco. And of course, it would somehow affect the economic growth. But in spite of these challenges, actually, the region is growing at an acceptable level. So the economic growth was 1.8% in 2023. And this economic growth is likely to increase a little more in 2024 and much more in 2025. Part of the region, we see a very important group of countries like GCC economies. GCC economies are expected to be the fastest growing region actually in the world compared to other regions, as it can be seen from the chart on the right-hand side. These GCC economies actually are achieving economic growth on average around 0.5%, which is a little below, as you can see, below the European Union economic growth. But as you can see, like in 2024 and 2025, this region actually is going to grow faster and faster. If we go for more details across individual economies, we can notice that like most of the economies are expected to slow down in the near term, except like a few countries like United Arab Emirates, Qatar, for example. These two countries are expected to enhance economic growth in 2024. And of course, economic growth in MENA region is supported by robust economic and domestic demand, as well as capital inflows and some ongoing economic reforming programs implemented by MENA economies also have an impact on the enhancement of economic growth. To highlight the drivers of economic growth from supply side, very important to explain the factors that contribute to the growth in the region in the long run. we see that employment per capita is a key factor and its contribution actually tend to be larger than the contribution of capital stock. And there's other factors that boost productivity, like technology institutions and policies. And economies of the region actually are doing very well in one or two parts of these total factor productions. The contribution of employment per capita reflected to the improvement in GDP per capita income. And GDP per capita tend to be higher in GCC economies, in particular, compared to other countries which are mostly oil importers. Again, labor force participation rate tend to be higher in GCC economies, like four countries exceeding the world average, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman. In spite of the highest level of unemployment rate concentrated in Arab states, which are the vast majority of MENA region compared to other region across the world. Turning to the demand side of the economy and how would demand factors contribute to the economic growth in the region. And of course, there's a lot to say about the decomposition of the aggregate demand. However, we try to talk about it briefly. Like on on the right hand side, we have total national investment saving and total investment. Very interesting charts to focus on. In terms of national saving, we see there is a upward sloping curve. This curve actually there's some countries below the line, other countries above the line. Of course, the intuition behind this scattered plots. For example, countries below the line, these countries, the national saving expected to decrease in the short term, while for countries over the line, the national saving expected to increase. The other countries actually with a negative national saving. Of course, there is a logic behind the negative in the sense that when there is a negative national saving, it means that the consumption goes beyond the income actually, or the national income the country earn. For total investment as well, we have very good chart, and it gives us a approximate picture about how total investment as a component of aggregate demand can contribute to the economic growth. And we know that the core movement of the investment component tend to be higher than higher than the consumption and net exports if we talk about the pro-cyclicality of this component in particular, as it goes alongside the business cycle as same direction. If you get these two charts together, so we'll have a very interesting chart here about the twin balance as a percent of GDP in 2023. And we can observe that in countries where national saving is much higher than investment, so this country enjoy considerable level of current account balance. And of course, they can take advantage of this surplus and invest it abroad, and then would give them an opportunity to build a buffer in order to encounter any exogenous shocks they might face actually in the future. Inflation sources of very important as well. In the region, actually, the source of inflation, varies across countries. For example, some countries actually are subject to demand shocks, such as domestic demand or external demand, or sometimes other countries subject to supply shocks. For example, assume an increase in global commodity prices that would, of course, would have a negative impact on the commodity importers. Or, for example, any shift happen in consumption due to government policies, for example. this, of course, would lead uh, to uh, to fluctuation in inflation rate or price levels. Any incentives, for example, given to producers who produce goods and services, or any lack of incentives that have to be given actually to the producers in order to produce more goods and services to meet the demand, the domestic demand or external demand. All this would have an impact on the economy. Another dimension we can look at it actually is very important. It is widely known that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, but in very extreme cases, when inflation actually exceeds a particular level or threshold, for example, 50%, this can be a physical phenomenon. Well, there's actually a dispute between policymakers and thinkers. Think about the difference between whether inflation is a monetary phenomenon or fiscal phenomenon. This happened actually in some few countries in 1990s, and I did some research on it regarding the phenomenon of the inflation, the episodes of inflation during 1990s, and I could get strong evidence that the inflation, when it turned to be hyperinflation, then in this case is driven by fiscal factors. When the public debt increase and the government is unable to service that debt, then it goes to other source of finance. Well, one of them might be that like printing money, or like borrowing from the central bank, or maybe the domestic borrowing from the banking sector. All this actually will lead to inflationary pressure. Well, from this slide on, we try to talk about the response. What's the potential response of macroeconomic policies to inflation and economic growth? And of course, that depends on country-specific factors and depends on surrounding circumstances, and also subject to uncertainties that surround the MENA region. And the monetary policy making process depends on what nominal anchor the central bank might use, and what monetary policy framework the central bank might consider that it is like appropriate for the current economic conditions or the monetary condition in particular. For example, some countries in the region are maintaining the inflation targeting regime, or depend on inflation as a nominal anchor for the monetary policy making process. Like, for example, Egypt, Tunisia, and these two countries are gradually shifting to the inflation targeting regime. Of course, there's some preconditions that have to be there, like otherwise we cannot guarantee the success of the inflation targeting regime. We have very good experience from Japan in 2010, 2011, 2012 during Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan at that time. So did a very ambitious program, Abenomic. And of course, Makoto, you know more about this program than me. Before we go to the exchange rate regime, the preconditions have to be there as accountability, transparency, and the monetary policy autonomy. And here we talk about the internal autonomy, not external, because when we talk about external autonomy, we talk about the monetary policy direction has to some extent be as the same direction of the trading partner monetary policy direction if the domestic economy is pegging the currency against the trading partner currency. Another important monetary policy framework is the exchange rate. Some countries actually are targeting exchange rate as a nominal anchor, and this mainly GCC economies. And of course, same as inflation targets, there should be some preconditions. And of course, the precondition available for in terms of exchange rate target regime, which is the official reserve. And if any deviation, like from the announced exchange rate, so the central bank step in and intervene to protect that regime. The monetary aggregate regime, another one being used by Sudan, but it's still, like there's some few countries are shifting from the monetary aggregate regime to the inflation targeting, because inflation target regime is the regime that, and also exchange rate as well, the regime that, can contribute to the monetary stability. Here, this an important slide as well, like monetary stance and monetary condition. We need to distinguish between what do we mean by monetary stance and what do we mean by monetary conditions. And of course, they're different terms. I mean, the nominal term and real term. And always and everywhere, the monetary stance is where the central bank announce the policy direction, whether the central bank want to increase or decrease the policy rate, cut it or hike it, or whether we as a central banker actually need to intervene the market as buyer or seller, or in terms of the reserve ratio. But the spillover effect and the transmission mechanism of this announcement will be reflected into the market, and there we have interaction, and there should be interaction between variables, no coordination between variables. While in nominal term, monetary stance, we talk about the coordination between policymakers. Here, the difference between what we call it interaction and what we call it coordination. And of course, there's some variables are waiting there in the monetary, money market. For example, we have domestic prices, we have for example, foreign prices as well. And when these two variables meet up together, so we will have real interest rate or real exchange rate, and also the reflection would be into the financial sector and aggregate demand as well. Actually, central bank take advantage of several policy tools, and these policy tools help the central bank actually achieve the core objective, which is the price stability. Of course, this in addition to other objectives like exchange rate stability, financial stability, and also unemployment rate has to be low, and output, potential output, has to be enhanced, and equal to the actual output. So the thing here that we need to talk about is about the policy tools. It depends on what central bank want to do. Like if the central bank, for example, want to affect the supply side of credit here, the most appropriate policy tools that central bank has used is the interest rate. The reserve ratio, because the reserve ratio directly affects the ability of commercial banks whether to provide credit or to feel cautious of providing credit. If the central bank want to affect the demand side of credit market, for example, the most appropriate tool here is interest rate. Well, because household or private sector in general actually would feel reluctant to borrow at higher cost, and that, of course, would push private sector actually to find out other places where the private sector actually can maximize the profit. For example, if the central bank want to affect directly the liquidity market, for example, here the most appropriate tool that can affect the liquidity market directly could be the open market operation by selling or buying government bonds. Well, it depends on the market. For example, foreign exchange market, the central bank might sell or buy foreign currencies against domestic currencies. And of course, that would finally affect the monetary pace because we have two components on the right-hand side, net domestic asset and net foreign assets. The current practice right now, and this year actually earlier, we witnessed rounds of policy rate cuts from some central banks in the region, and of course following uh, the 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 central bank, the monetary policy of the Fed reserves. And here we always talk about economic puzzling. I mean, for example, very interesting paper actually being published by by the World Bank talking about how to resolve puzzles on monetary policy transmission in emerging markets, and mainly talk about the price puzzles and exchange rate uh, puzzles. Well, the central bank, I mean, in countries where the exchange rate is pegged against the exchange as the currency of a trading partner, they always try to avoid any policy trilemma uh, associated with the direction of the monetary policy. And here, there is a group of countries that actually is similar to each other's in terms of the specific factors. For example, GCC economies, in addition to Jordan, they have a fixed exchange rate. And these three options, the central bank cannot have them all, like the free capital mobility, the big exchange rate, and the monetary autonomy. Uh, I mean, if any differences in terms of the interest rate, there would be a movement of capital from country A to country B, or from the trading partner to the domestic economy, or vice versa. That's why here we choose some policy options that can be applicable I mean, group of countries in the region. And we see that in Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Egypt, Mauritania, and Yemen, well, the policy option number two would be most suitable for this group of countries. And also, we have a couple of things actually we need to consider, because when we talk about exchange rate, we talk about the fixed exchange rate, which refers to hard peg. Otherwise, it could be like a flexible regime, even if the central bank is begging within a narrow band, because it allows for a limited fluctuation within the band. If the exchange rate actually exceeds the band, then the central bank might find a way to intervene in order to bring it back to the band. Monetary policy regime, we have autonomy and versus non-autonomy. And in terms of the monetary autonomous or non-autonomous of the monetary policy, here we can take into account two kind of monetary policy autonomy. Like, for example, inside the country on the domestic economy, the central bank need to make a decision away from um, any influencing actually from other parties. Like, for example, in the situation where there's a fiscal dominance, in this case, the fiscal policy actually has upper hand to control the monetary condition, and this would lead to I mean, I would say that would lead to disaster, you know. But we have external autonomy, uh, or non-autonomy. I mean, the external part of the monetary non-autonomy is when the central bank follows the direction of the monetary policy of the trading partner. And I don't think that this could be as risky as the internal autonomy. Here, the second part of the macroeconomic policy is the fiscal policy rule. And of course, the contribution of the fiscal policy to the stabilization of the economy is very important. And here we talk about some actions actually have to be done on the revenue side or the expenditure side. These called the discretionary actions, and all this led by policymakers in the country. On the other hand, we have what is called cyclical factors, or the automatic stabilizers, and these automatic stabilizers are actually very large in advanced economies and emerging and high income countries as well, uh, and very small in developing countries, at least developing countries, and low-income countries as well. Um, because because there's, I mean, the institution setting in advanced economy and high-income countries, well, is very strong and very robust. Also, the tax base in these countries, uh, like not as small as in countries where there is a weak institution framework. The business cycle, the movement, fluctuations in commodity prices also and asset prices uh, can affect the fiscal policy rule. Then fiscal policy makers need to make some diagnostic analysis to the fiscal stance and also to assess whether fiscal policy is sustainable or unsustainable. Well, here the adjustment the adjustment has to be done on the revenue side and expenditure side. And of course, we can go for different disaggregation. If, for example, focus on the revenue side, we can go for tax and non-tax revenue, or we can go for another disaggregation, like, for example, oil revenue and non-oil revenue. And here we see some countries in the region are doing very well in terms of the revenue. Like some countries are doing economic reforming programs on improving the tax administration and avoid any tax smuggling. And other countries are doing very well in terms of like diversifying their economies from not only relying on oil as their main source of revenue, but relying on other source of revenues. And of course, like GCC economies are implementing very ambitious economic diversification programs that goes in line with the strategic vision of these countries. Like some of the countries actually strategic vision lasts in 2030, 2035. And the good thing is that on expenditure side, these economies are spending on infrastructure services. For example, there are like mega projects across countries. In UAE, for example, Mohammed bin Rashid Solar, this one very important mega project that's being implemented by the government. In Qatar, we have Losail Marina, Voya Waterfront Tower. Saudi Arabia also actually spending around $500 billion on a new city, which is located actually on the west part of the kingdom. Oman National Railway project considered one of the very important projects that the government spent money on it. Egypt, Tunisia. Egypt has a new administrative capital, um, and Tunisia has the Sport City project. All these, infrastructure projects are likely to contribute to the development and economic growth in the long run for these countries. So the question here remains is, before I go to the buffer and how could country actually build a buffer in order to protect itself from the exogenous shocks, we have very important and very interesting papers here from the IMF talking about the economic diversification in developing countries, and other one address the efforts of the economic diversification by Arab countries, by GCC economies in 2020, in 2014. The question of how to build a buffer is depends on different factors. For example, the countries that need to build a buffer need to do some economic reforming in terms of the business climate, or to improve the education level, or for example, work on the financial system and make it like as deep as in advanced economies, or for example, try to develop the domestic infrastructure for these countries. I think I'm here like last thing is debt sustainability. And this sustainability is very important. And most of the countries actually are implementing the medium debt management strategy plan. This strategy plan is very important for the countries to help them how to service their debt in order not to fall in the trap in terms of any potential economic problems, and tries to link the capacity of borrowing to the macroeconomic fundamentals. Here are some policy recommendations. I'm happy actually to provide it for anyone actually interested to take one of them or take them all. Like for example, because the problem of some economies in the region is the lack of governance and lack of institutional settings. So that's why I started with this recommendation. The improvement of governance and institutional quality, very important part. Unless we have this kind of reform, actually, we cannot um, implement any rational policy or any sound macroeconomic policies. Governments need to work on supply side policies as well. But unfortunately, if we don't have a good governance or we don't have very strong institutional setting, so we won't be able to work on supply side policies that enhance the productivity in the long run. Try to implement policies to reduce income inequality and to enhance the equality of the income and ensure equal access to education, like health care and opportunities as well. Try to maintain sound fiscal and monetary policies that achieve the core macroeconomic objectives and create a favorable investment climate. And this favorable investment climate actually would encourage foreign investors to invest in the domestic economies, and that would of course actually would have pros and cons. And we try to take advantage of the foreign direct investment and employ it actually for the benefit of the country or the benefit of the region. Uh, Try to encourage this sustainable development practice, and we try to learn from the best practice in other regions, for example, in ASEAN, in Latin America, or in Europe, for example, in order to apply it on our domestic economies. I think this is the last of my presentation, Makoto. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to participate at Sora Economic Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I have a few questions, and then we'll see what the audience has. One is kind of a comment. It seems that the fiscal theory of inflation that you talked about seems like it's more of like a governance deficiency, because if you allocate money in the right way, you won't have inflation, obviously, but maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, very true, Makoto. As I mentioned, like the dispute, and of course, you know, by the end of the day, the effect will be on the monetary pace. But the story actually begins with the failure of fiscal policymakers actually to control. I mean to service debt or to control the budget deficit because of some difficult circumstances. You know, like in some countries where there is a war, for example, or conflicts or geopolitical tensions. We see the government spend too much money on these things, and then create budget deficit, and that deficit, unfortunately, because the government is unrest or unstable, then we'll try to go for the easy source of finance, which is the central bank. You know, try to push the central bank. I mean, and by force get the money from it. You know, and finance that deficit. And of course, you know, by the end of the day, the impact will be on the monetary base. And but the story begins from the fiscal side. Well, it could be a dispute, and it could be like a very good discussion, interesting discussion, whether inflation after a threshold after 50%, for example, as Taylor say, is considered to be a fiscal phenomena or monetary phenomena. But yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. It could be a very good topic, I mean, to search. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could argue that all inflation is a governance phenomena because how you allocate money in the economy really is what determines whether you get more production or you get asset bubbles or CPI. Um, I thought that was I thought that was interesting that you also put out or pointed out that you need to strengthen institutions in order to have a stronger governance. Is one of your policy recommendations. So I think that's really important to have a good training of staff and capacity development because you don't always see that. And far too often people keep a very simplistic view of economic policies or equilibrium models that don't
Mhm.
really exist in the real world. So it's important to actually have policies that will work with the complex environment that we're in. And that's why the previous speaker from Central Bank of Egypt was talking about antitrust laws. You kind of need a whole framework of regulation, um, not just moving interest rate numbers up and down. So, because it's really how you allocate the money in the economy, and that has to be regulated as long as commercial banks, which are private companies, are creating most of the money supply.
Yeah, you're
Um,
right. Yeah, you're right, Makoto. One of the most difficulties actually most of the countries in the region are facing, like the widespread of the informal economy. Most of the money is circulated outside the official channels. And this is a case actually facing in Sudan, like a couple of years ago, in terms of the foreign exchange and remittances that we receive from Sudanese working abroad. All this goes through like informal channels. So the money allocated in the economy, right? Uh, very very important to capture, and to make it go legally, like throughout formal channel. Right. Thank you.
and I should have asked the previous speaker, but what's going on in Egypt? Because Egypt has quite high inflation, even though it's a very resource-rich and fairly politically stable country.
Yeah. Yeah, Egypt, well, Egypt is very important economy in the region, very important, similar like as economies. And also not only for MENA region, but also for Africa and other countries in the world like Europe. Um, well, Egypt is facing like, an acceleration increase in the price, the difficult situation in neighboring countries actually push many people from these countries to travel, travel to to Egypt. They find a very safe place there in Egypt. Of course, that put pressure on the consumption side, and people actually want to consume more goods and services there. And the last, the recent difficult situation in Sudan, like Sudanese go to Egypt actually with uh, with the money they save actually over the past maybe 20 years or 30 years, and of course they go there. The price increase time after time and cause high inflation rates. Other reasons, um, the reason why inflation is high it may be attributed to the commodity price shocks due to geopolitical tension in Europe. For example, the increase in commodity prices because Egypt sometimes, considered to be a commodity importers for the goods produced in Europe. And that, of course, actually would put pressure on the domestic prices. Well, other example is that in terms of the capital flows, well, uh, it has been said that in the last few years, like there was like a kind of capital flights, and the government, the line authorities actually in Egypt actually try to control these capital flights in order to prevent any exchange rate shocks. So yeah, this might be the main reason for the high inflation rates in Egypt.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's kind of a structural problem because they don't. Uh, well, it's bounce payments issue, really, because they're importing too much and don't produce enough of the consumables, which which makes sense. But yeah, before the conflict in Sudan, of course, there was Libya, and so it's been a long time now with conflicts in neighboring countries, so it makes sense. Um, let's see. I had a question about well, I had more of a comment. So you mentioned how different central banks in the region are making monetary stance announcements, and that's being priced into the market. Um, Historically, though, these the effects of these announcements is usually pretty short-lived, like within 1 to 3 months, and so the efficacy is not really long-term. Um, so just more of a comment than a question. There's one question from the audience. How, how could a wider conflict in the Middle East affect the global economy and markets?
Well, you know, because I don't want to go politics, I'm gonna talk the impact. I'm gonna talk about the impact of these conflicts on the economy. Like we see the trade disruption, the Red Sea, like many goods and services are uh, like passing through the Red Sea in order to get to other countries beyond the Red Sea. Of course, this would make sort of delay actually in terms of the timing that at which these goods have to be there in the receiving countries, for example. The some countries like, for example, Sudan is considered to be like a rich resource economy or economy with intensive resources. Like any I mean, any difficult situation would delay the production capacity of this economy, and then the uh, commodity importers would be affected. Like country like Lebanon, for example. Lebanon rely on tourism sector as a very good contributor to the economic growth and the GDP of the Lebanon. So, any uh, unstable situation over there, so of course would affect the country itself.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I think it could have global implications because of higher petrochemical prices, for instance, that would have a big impact on especially island nations and vulnerable countries. Um,
Yeah.
we have a couple other questions. Let's see, several questions actually. So, what are the vulnerabilities of growth in resource-rich countries? Because, as you mentioned, many of the countries that you pointed out do have a lot of natural resources and value from that. Um, but as is often the case in life, you don't always see successful outcomes, even if countries have lots of resources. So, um, what are the traps that these countries should try to prevent from falling into?
Um, well, investing in capital stock, uh, in the very beginning of my presentation, as you remember, first slide, it talk about the drivers of economic growth in the long run, and we notice that the contribution of labor productivity tend to be higher than the contribution of capital stock. That's mean, and there's some countries actually lying on the negative side, and that means that like these countries are not uh, like uh, are not I mean giving more attention actually to the capital stock. That means these countries are not investing in goods and services that are used to produce other goods and services. For example, in countries like in some countries, like raw materials are exported. At the times, these raw materials can be reproduced inside the economy, and then, re-exported as a value added, um, as a value added. The main reason behind is that the lack of governance, the lack of like decentralization of the economic system in this economy. The lack of, for example, institutional setting and legal frameworks. There have to be like comprehensive reforms, like structural transforming programs have to be implemented by these countries.
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, it seems to be a governance
Yeah, yeah,
capacity issue
right.
as anything else.
Yeah.
There's two more questions. One, if a system such as Sora, where non-predatory credit creation could be implemented in a country with deficits to support productive output, would it help to mitigate this solution in your opinion? So basically, could you use cryptocurrency uh, allocated to producers in the country to mitigate some of the problems with the predatory credit um, being offered?
Well, some countries, especially high-income states in the region, like GCC in particular, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, are spending money on, I mean, artificial intelligence, which is a very good step, like very good efforts, and that, of course, will help these countries to diversify their economies and take advantage of artificial intelligence, to boost productivity. But for other countries, it's quite difficult, because I mean, they don't have they enough fiscal space. They can use it. I mean, and they always fall in the deficit trap from the fiscal side. Um, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. There's one final question. The audience member says, very informed and useful presentation. There's an increasing interest towards reshaping the business model of central banks to deal with digital financial institutions. Um, and this can be a game changer in the financial industry. What kind of advice do you have for emerging and developing countries with respect to, I guess, expanding digital finance? And I assume things like CBDCs, cryptocurrencies would also be there.
Um, yeah, I mean, well, uh, digital, I mean, the use of digital transformation in the financial sector, uh, like, for example, use very advanced digital identity for consumers or borrowers who want to borrow from SMEs or borrow from the financial system. Well, the digital identity helps the central bank to, I mean, to track down any borrower that actually might fall behind regarding of his inability I mean, to pay back his obligations. For example, the central bank might take advantage of digital transformation to reduce the non-performance loans in commercial banks. And also, central bank can put some regulation related to the usage of digital instruments like digital ID or, for example, know your customer approach. These, of course, or for example, the clearance of checks actually between commercial banks, or for example, central bank can take advantage of digital transformation to implement like very advanced liquidity marketing between commercial banks, where commercial banks borrow and lend among themselves before they make a headache to the central bank. Yeah, I mean the use of digital transformation in the financial system very important for central banks to adapt.
Yeah, I think a low-hanging fruit would be using this to do real-time supervision of loans. Then the central bank can actually uh, determine if they're going to create systemic risks before they happen. For example,
Exactly.
real estate bubbles, which you
Exactly.
often see if there's too many real estate transactions. So central banks can, if they have real-time supervision, they can mitigate these risks before they happen. So actually, you see this, uh, yeah, in some countries, the reporting happens, several weeks after the loan is done. And that's too late in the real world to try to mitigate
Exactly.
things.
Exactly.
So I think that's a good comment. Um, I don't see any other questions, but I think your talk was very interesting. So thanks a lot for your time, and I think I think it was is really valuable information.
An ancient prophecy foretold an eclipse that would open a portal to a mystical world, the world of Soratopia, where honor, valor, and swords determine your fate. You can become one of them. Choose your path. Become a true samurai. Explore the vast world of Soratopia. Defeat mighty bosses in various locations. Your sword is your strength and honor. Don't worry, you're not alone. In Soratopia, you'll find loyal waifus to relax with. Engage in the game, pray, complete quests, and accumulate points to become eligible for a massive airdrop. Your path determines your destiny. Choose wisely. The eclipse has awakened, and so have you.
try to believe you.
Thank you.